in general, and I think it applies to a number of the presentations. I've been battling in my own mind over the last few years with the idea of community benefit, but individual liability and cost. So I've gone to places where there's a great tree, the owner has no money, can't maintain it, doesn't have the expertise to maintain it, and so wants to remove it. Local government rightly says no because of the community benefit. And I've been thinking, how can we deal with that? How can we be more equitable and fair? And some of the things I think of, there should be some local government schemes where they put some money aside to help, or maybe there's some tax deductions. But I wonder whether any of you have thought about how we might recognise the society benefit and compensate for the individual cost and liability.
Greg, I would have thought as a social media aficionado, you would have known that they could get crowdfunding, and that they would get onto one of these crowdfunding places, crowdfunding sites, and put a photo of their tree and say, I need funds to prune this tree.
And it seems that relates to, what City of Melbourne are doing, where you can send an email to a tree. Like, how could you start to make linkages between, crowdfunding as a resource and that the way in which a public might express their values about that tree publicly.
And in places like LA, you have people adopting trees that have been planted, on the sidewalk and things like that. So there's nothing wrong with the idea of a tree having nephews and nieces, and that idea in people who actually come around and visit it. So there's actually lots of sort of garden exchange, veggie exchange schemes in the suburbs now, and broadening that idea of out to, are people willing to do a working bee on a tree that needs it every now and then? That kind of stuff. Want to come around and visit the tree, and we could share those sorts of things.
I didn't mean to be facetious before. I think it's a tricky situation, and I see it every day, and there's lots of people who own trees that they can't afford to maintain, and they are told they can't remove them. It's a very tricky situation, but I think it would be difficult to set up something like a council tax or something where the public, through the council, is paying for someone's tree. As a landowner, you have to pay for everything else on your property, and I suppose it's part of that notion that people start seeing trees as assets, and so if you buy a big expensive house, you will pay to look after it. If you have a big expensive tree, you have to pay to look after it. And it is unfair that some people have either inherited or grown their own trees that they can't afford to maintain. That's an unfair thing, or it's a tricky thing, and maybe there is some creative solution. I'm not sure what it is, but crowdfunding is an idea.
Greg, I was going to say, I think it's an interesting proposition. We're exploring the idea of the public realm and looking at, whether you incentivise greening within that space. But tree maintenance, I think, would be another, it's another leap, really. So, but, those ecosystem services are to the benefit of the community. So I think there's some interesting ideas there.
Roger, I've been reading about conventional economics attempts to price non-market values for 40 years, and it's not going anywhere. Is it worth persisting with, or do we just convert to social value, which doesn't have a dollar sign in front of it, if we wish to pursue these issues with decision makers?
Sometimes it does work. It works with health. The AMO is always doing it. They always say that this disease or absenteeism or whatever it is costing the Australian economy X dollars. A lot of that's actually through shadow pricing. We did a study in the west of Melbourne where we were looking at local pollution, and we came up with, using transfer of benefits, a cost to the community of about 17,000 people there, that between 400 and 500 million over the past 20 years, based on what we thought was reasonably sound data. that creates, it does create a case for action. I think it's a combination of both, and where we're looking at community values, economics doesn't have tools for that. But that was one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about discount rates, because, you know, I'd dearly love to do some research on that. I think if we ask communities what they would discount an urban forest at, or at a park at, or something like that, in real what we call rates of time preference would be very, very low. Nick Stern got caned for putting very low rates on his climate change study by a bunch of people. Well, I actually think if we come back to these sorts of assets and the planet, that's actually the real answer. So some of these things we actually have to get into economics, into economic practice. 7% is insane. We're going to take them on over that. So we've just been in the UK and said they're double your figures. What do you think of that? So we will get commentary from, you know, people elsewhere in the world sort of saying, well, do Australians consider their environment to be worth half of what people in the UK do? That's just ridiculous.
Oh, sorry, second row.
So do you think we have learned from Docklands there all the problems associated with that?
Who's going to take that one on?
I don't want to touch that one. Fisherman's Bend's coming up. You know, it's on the horizon, and I would hope that we'd learnt from Docklands. Docklands is still an emerging space, and so in terms of the trees and the tree planting, you know, we see that very much as a laboratory. Like the tried and tested species have been there, and some have won and some have failed. And we've got a couple of trial sites down there where we're trialling new trees for that sort of space, and hopefully those learnings will then translate to Fisherman's Bend. But yeah, I mean, I can only really speak from the tree perspective. I mean, there's some other sort of inherent issues with Docklands that are beyond that. So.
On that, I think one positive that's coming out of areas that are where new residents are moving in and where suburbs are being developed in new ways, there are opportunities there for the people who are coming into that suburb to really help shape the feeling and the culture of the trees in that suburb. And I think that if we can sort of flip it as well as to be a positive, who are moving into these places, and what are the kind of cultural backgrounds and connections to tree experiences for them, so that in places that might not be thought of as particularly favourable for urban forest, but really significant in terms of the mitigating effects of those trees and for the community feeling of it being home, that we can cultivate a sense of custodianship as well.
Stuart? No. Broken it, Stuart.
Project.
I wonder if each person could say a little bit more about the role art might play. I mean, we've seen a little bit about that, but for example, communities not having the words, but having a free disposable camera to go for a half an hour wander and tell you what they value about their suburb, or celebrating, you know, commemorating a tree that's going to be cut down for whatever reason, but, you know, having does this have a role? Is it being used? Could it be used more and smarter?
Yes. I think it's really significant, especially if you want to introduce new people to this conversation, and have that cultural value communicated in a way that might not be by dollars or by words. And for people who connect with trees in a different way, sometimes art is the way that they can communicate that. And so I think it's a very powerful tool.
And I think art can be a way in which to translate some of those cultural values that may be, you know, a little more abstract for people to understand, but that art is somehow a little more, or has some sort of potential to be more accessible, to accept, you know, to be able to appreciate some of those more cultural values that may, you know, otherwise be not have a voice or not have a, you know, a means of translation to a wider audience.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a question to Jessica. Specifically, I really enjoyed your talk and I really appreciated art being brought into this conversation. I was just wondering, with the difficulties sort of talking about community engagement and participation, I was just wondering, in terms of your exhibition being so site-specific, how that work existed beyond that, or how you create that dialogue and participation now?
That's a really great question, thank you. As part of that exhibition, I did have a series of the volunteers from the volunteer guides from the Botanic Gardens did a series of tours that actually visited those trees that were photographed in both collections of, like, in my project and in the archival photographs. And so for me, that was a really important way of including not only the community of the Botanic Gardens, but the general public that might visit that site. And for me, it was also really important in what that added to reading the kind of cultural, social values of those trees, kind of beyond their photographic representation. And I think, that's maybe part of my project that wasn't really there, but I think, could be expanded upon now, now that I look back at it. And something that, as you said, it's so site-specific. It's really, I'd love to, be able to show that to another community, but I don't know how to kind of make that translation. Yeah.
I guess my question is mainly towards David, simply because he represents a council. I've often wondered how much thought goes into the height of trees that are planted in the streets, whether they considered, for instance, planting under power lines. They would put trees in which get to 11 metres, or in some cases, for instance, a silky oak, which probably gets to over 20 metres, planting those under power lines which are probably only 6 metres from the ground. What are they thinking? They're just accepting that there's going to be a lot of maintenance involved, or why don't they choose more appropriate height-sized trees?
I'd like to think we're a bit smarter than we were, in the past in terms of tree height, and it's really about the right tree in the right place. So it's about the function of the tree, but we want to plant the largest tree possible to maximise the ecosystem services benefit without those conflicts with infrastructure. So what we're doing a lot at the City of Melbourne is we're moving trees to the middle of the road rather than concentrating our tree planting in footpaths. So we'll typically put a medium or small deciduous tree in the footpath so that people have solar access in winter, but then we'll put a large evergreen tree in the middle of the road where you haven't got power lines and you haven't got conflicts with private property or footpaths. And that evergreen tree then provides ecosystem services year round, rather than a deciduous tree dropping its leaves and so forth. So that's, we're coming at it from a perspective that we look at the street topology in all cases. So our diversity guidelines at the City of Melbourne, we have guidelines for trees for different typologies. We look to match, as I said earlier, match the tree to the site essentially.
There are also times where the site, I think, can change, and it's worth keeping that as part of the conversation, not just accepting that this is the way that the city is, therefore we can't change the way that the city is, and especially where new developments are coming up, those power lines can go underground, and I think it's really, it's important to sort of fight for that too, not just accept the way it is.
Here, thank you for that. I was going to jump down someone's throat. It's always the trees that make the compromise. It's never the... anyway, I won't go with that. Jessica, I wanted to make just a couple of observations and perhaps get a response from you. I often use, as I said earlier in the day, postcards, not just to give me an indication of how things have grown, but also of fashion and of place, why things were certainly done at that time. And that's been a great benefit to me. But I wanted to speak to you about the lantern slides, because I have an intimate relationship with some, and I've been badly bruised by the relationship that sort of fits in with other aspects of the talk. The collection of lantern slides at Burnley when I first came there was marvellous. We had a very big collection, and we had the projector still that was used to project them. And in my early days, this is in the early 80s, before I was principal, I talked to people about those slides, as I mentioned to you in the break. And I talked to people who used them for their illustrated lectures as part of their jobs, communicating with certain groups at night in the 1920s and earlier. And the slides, as far as I know, were stolen in the early 80s, and the projector went not long after. But it was interesting, amongst a certain group of us, there was a real grief, because it was a part of Burnley that had disappeared. We didn't know what happened to them. I can remember trying to get the principal of the day to get the police involved, to go and find them. And that didn't happen for various reasons. But interestingly enough, they turned up anonymously to the Melbourne City Council a couple of years ago. And the Melbourne City Council ran an exhibition of them. And I'm very curious because I couldn't bring myself to go to the exhibition. I've not seen the slides because I consider them to be out of their place. And I'm wondering whether you'd comment on that.
It's a really great comment. Thanks, Greg. And it does really highlight that, that photographs are more than just kind of documents. They're more than just objectively record what is there. And that what you might value in a photograph might be quite different from what another person sees in that photograph. And I think, your example obviously kind of highlights some of that kind of dilemma. But it does also point to, that importance of those photographic objects, which are kind of, for me, is really, I think we don't value photographs as objects anymore. They kind of circulate digitally now, and I think that, that having to deal with the object created a link between that object and the site to which it refers to, Burnley in that case, and that, it seems to me that, what you collect for an archive is often, it's valued for different reasons once it's in the archive than what it was produced for. And, if you think about that, do they really belong to Melbourne City Council now, or do they, they should really kind of be returned to their rightful place? But this is a problem with art kind of globally, Statues are removed from historic sites, from churches, and put into museums, They all have context, and photographs are no different.
Online petition, repatriate Burnley slides.
Yeah. I'll sign it for you.
I'm just glad they're there.
Well,
That sense of relief.
Well, someone's now looking after them as well, because they need to be maintained, through in archival conditions as well, quite pragmatically.
Greg, I think you also touch on grief and grief around stories and grief around place. And I think that trees have an amazing capacity to, like I said in the talk, to take us somewhere else. And through the loss of those photographs, your stepping stone to that place has gone. And there's a lot of work in the kind of tension between conservation and restoration now, trying to understand this. Richard Hobbs put a paper out, I think it was last year, that was called Grieving for the Past and Hoping for the Future, Balancing Conservation and Restoration. I think that's really what we're speaking about in the context of the urban forest as well. We value it, we want to maintain, this is a garden history society group, but we also know that we need to put in the trees for the future, we need to replace them. So I would also say take new photos, create those for people in the future to have connections to now.
Man in the front.
Simply just wanted to make a comment, Greg. Can we take a lead from the current cinema release of Women in Gold?
Yes, yes. Better than the Elgin marbles at the BM. Any more questions? Oh, yes, on the left.
Chris Betteridge from Sydney. There's been a lot of discussion at various times today about the risk that trees might pose, and we just had a comment about grief and trees. My brother-in-law and his family lost their house and garden in the bushfires in the Grampians February last year, and the family felt devastating grief at the loss not only of their house and livelihood, but also many of the very old river red gums on the property, many of which had cavities in them, and they burnt from the inside, sometimes for weeks. And I think I was wondering if David particularly might like to comment on the fact that in New South Wales, in response to the recent bushfires there, the government introduced statutory controls which allowed owners to clear trees if they were close to a bushfire zone, and yet many owners who weren't really suffering a risk from bushfire took advantage of that to clear trees for gaining harbour views and so on.
Yes, in fact, Victoria beat New South Wales to that because after the fires down here, Victoria brought in the 1030 rule, and then New South Wales, after the Blue Mountains bushfires, brought in 1050, is that right, the 1050 rule? And which gives people, for those who aren't aware of it, gives people the, where you have other tree controls, that is overlays or local laws protecting trees, it gives people the right to cut down or to remove all vegetation within 30 or 50 metres of their property, including all trees within 10 metres of their property. And when this started in the Dandenongs, the fear was that the people would be removing all these large mountain ash and mountain grey gums, especially that are up there, without the need to, because they weren't necessarily at a great bushfire risk. And I think there was some activity, probably more than there usually would be. There was more chainsaws going up there than there would have otherwise been. But I think it's a bit of a balance. We had, David was talking earlier about how a group kind of modifies itself, and I think in a community, and community standards are changing over time, but in a community people do monitor what's going on, and there is a level that gets reached. And there's always outliers, and there's always people who will remove trees unnecessarily. But also those big trees are very expensive to remove, and a lot of people aren't going to remove them if they don't have to. But certainly trees got removed that otherwise wouldn't have been. And the same would be happening in the Blue Mountains. I would say they were knee-jerk, it's a bit radical I suppose, but I think they were knee-jerk responses by the government, but the government has to be seen to be doing something. And it is good to do something because there's places that are in very risky areas. But it's more than trees, and it's a more complex issue than I would dare try to understand. At last year's court conference, we were actually in the Blue Mountains and got taken through those areas by the local fire authority, and it was a very interesting and enlightening experience. But I do think there's a very political bent to it, and it's a political move, and it's a knee-jerk reaction. And don't forget that all of those places have had houses and trees for a long time. That doesn't mean we shouldn't change what we do there, but there's other issues involved.
Carol.
I'm going to use the microphone.
The mic behind you.
Sorry. The case, Leshke and Robson,
Yes.
did that go through the Land and Environment Court sort of from the $220 fee?
Sorry, what was that? Did it?
Well, you mentioned about a $220 fee or something.
That's what it costs to put an application into the court. So in that case, the application fee, so in Robson and Leshke, the application fee, the same as this week I looked at a 2 metre oleander next to a fence.
Well,
the application fee is the same, $220 something. The difference is that the one that I looked at this week with an oleander next to a fence was a self-represented party and a local solicitor for the elderly woman next door who felt she couldn't represent herself. In Robson and Leshke, you would have had a different situation. You would have had the money didn't go in the court application, the money would have gone on legal fees.
The next half of the question is, that Canadian case that you showed, it was Canadian, wasn't it, with the lady next to the fence? What, under that sort of ruling or under rules in New South Wales, would that case stand up where the tree itself had to be protected? The one that's right on the boundary where the people are sharing the tree?
Oh, like I say, there's no... some things aren't defined and some things are defined. So when you have common law, nothing's really defined, and it's up to whoever's hearing a case to determine on what's in front of them and on the history of case law that's gone before them, what might be the most appropriate decision. With as soon as you've got statutory law, like the Trees Act, then certain things are written down and defined, and so the Act does its best to define what a tree is, for instance. You know, a tree is a woody thing or anything resembling a tree, and includes, for the purposes of the Act, things like bamboo, because bamboo can be a hedge. Where you talk about ownership, there's nothing that defines that, and so when we say, well, it's where the trunk is, traditionally courts in Australia have talked about where the trunk is at ground level in relation to a boundary. The Act is a little bit different because all it says is a tree has to be principally located on adjoining land. So sometimes ownership is shared, and if it's not known who planted a tree or where it started, and a tree is 60% on my property and 40% on David's property, we share ownership of the tree.
This is under the Act, right?
No, this isn't under the Act. This is just common law. We would share ownership of the tree.
Common law would be more useful in Western Australia because we do not have a land and environment court.
Well, you do have common law. So the law system we have has evolved from the English system. The Anglo, many countries around the world use the Anglo-Saxon law system, and that is, countries like even India, think of colonies. So New Zealand, Australia, India, Canada. So there's it's a very British sense of law, and a lot of countries like it. And that's common law. That's what we have in Western. Every state has common law. As soon as a state enacts an act about anything, be it about trees or anything else, that statutory law becomes, I suppose it's held above common law in a way, but common law works out how to interpret that. If you don't have an act in Western Australia, you don't have an act, but common law, we don't have an act here in Victoria, and so common law applies. But typically, so ownership might be shared between David and I, but under the Act in New South Wales, all that matters is where the tree is principally located, and if 60% is on my land, and if it's damaging David's property, he can take me to court under the Trees Act. That's not common law.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Anna.
Hi, I'm Anna Foley from the National Trust, and I work full-time on environmental advocacy. So I live in a bubble where everybody loves trees, and I'm really interested. It's been explained today, and it's well understood why people might not like trees, either on their property or next door. But what I never have a sense of is what proportion of that community does that ever represent? What you see in the tabloids after a storm, is that what everybody thinks or just what some people think? And I'm really interested in Lillian's research where maybe there's it's a bit more of a controlled environment perhaps, where you're looking at a broad cross-section of the community. Are we in a minority or a majority?
I don't feel equipped to answer that question. I think one of the downsides of social research is that it's always skewed by the people who are willing to participate in the study. And while I think it's simplistic to say there are people who hate trees, and I think it's about finding out how to communicate with those people, and Greg sort of showed that this morning as well. What also comes up in the papers, and those loud voices, the squeaky wheels as councils will call them, the people who are really vocal about this politically have more impact than many people who feel a different way. And I think that's not necessarily the best thing. We live in a democracy, but we're not voting on trees necessarily. But it is important to think of that political aspect of the story. So how can we get the community to mobilise over these issues? And tying it back to the previous question and David's comments, I think we don't have. While we have common law, it's not law of the commons. We don't see common goods as necessarily public assets, and trees on private land are operating as that for a lot of people. So ways of reimagining how we manage and how we maintain them in the arboricultural sense as well might be useful to look to that, and also to look to the intrinsic value of those things as well, and how we might recognise the place of other life in the city. And the law is going in a very interesting direction with that, of the rights of nature, you know, a lake that now has rights in New Zealand, you know, those broad approaches to saying that this is worth defending for its own sake, and maybe for its own sake for the community experience of that, but that one squeaky wheel, one loud person against that won't be able to actually overcome the greater wealth for us, but also for future generations that might become more important, or we know will become more important with changing climate as well.
Yeah, that it's also in part due to what we hear on the media is, of course, personal opinion, the squeaky wheel and stuff like that. Sorry, I thought I had my sound on my phone turned off. But also what we've been talking about in terms of community values and things like that is deliberative democracy at work, or civil society and community opinions. And so if we listen to what you were saying today about what happens in court with common law, that actually lays out risks and responsibilities quite well in terms of ownership and things like that. Then we had the question about being able to clear trees near properties, and that comes back into natural hazards and the understanding of those broad risks and how they might evolve. And that happens to be another area that we're working on in terms of changing fire risk, all of those sorts of things. So what's being lost in all of this is that if you actually map out the sets of the rights, responsibilities that are sort of stated in law that are implicit within the way that both the public and the private domains work, it's actually, I think, quite straightforward to articulate what general social responsibilities are in terms of sort of having trees on your property and maintaining your environment. People don't understand their risks, so we're moving people holus bolus out into peri-urban areas where fire risk has gone up by 1/3 since 1998, and the whole character of fires has changed. So we're actually putting people in harm's way without informing them of what the risks are. And so from that point of view, rights, risks, responsibilities, those sorts of things like that, we need a much more mature conversation that helps to lay that out. And of course, on the other side, we've got the love for trees, which people can express if they're allowed. And I think if that's tempered with some of the duties and everything like that, it means that an off-the-cuff opinion or what you think today or that kind of thing becomes much less important, and the structured nature of the conversation becomes much more important. It's a difficult thing to do, but it's the sort of thing I think we need to have, mature and discuss. And I guess today, and I'd like to thank the organisers, is sort of gives us an opportunity to say our bit about what we think those conversations might have.
Often when I arrive at a tree dispute, it becomes quite clear early on that it's not about the tree, especially when people are self-represented. When they're self-represented and they want to tell you, well, that he threw dog poo over the garden, and they on purpose start their barbecue when we're outside, and they film my daughter in the pool. And in fact, this week it was video cameras pointing at each other's gardens, and they film everything that they do in each other's gardens, everything. And it's not about the tree. And I'd kind of like to think that, actually extend that, I don't see why anybody would hate trees or be angry about trees. And the people who are probably angry about something else.
But trees are an easy scapegoat, which was also raised this morning. And I think, going back to the gentleman's comments in the back, that complexity, the irony is people often move to those areas because they're so treed. You know, we live in Australia, it's a disturbance ecology. These trees evolve with fire, and just living with that, you know, responsibility, being able to respond and make those choices in an informed way, so education is appropriate, so people know that what living with trees means, I think is really important.
Last question. In the far back. Oh, sorry. You really have to, Richard.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask the panel, about this 10:30 rule. I live in the lower Dandenongs, and I see gaps in the mountain appear weekly, and it's subtle. No, they won't cut down the big ones, but I fear they're cutting down the next generation because they're easy to handle, and I think it's just this subtle erosion of the landscape. The understory never ever gets considered, of which there's it's diverse, very diverse, and it's lost. There's no education. I was on the back of a fire truck in '97, and frankly, all the houses that burnt down in the '97 bushfires, they should never ever have been there. And so to educate on fires, that's taken decades, and to educate on trees, it's almost a loss.
We'll take that as a comment. Definitely the last.
Good afternoon, Andrew Patrick. My consultancy is Open Space Management. It's been a great day. I think everyone here has a feeling and a love for trees. I'm looking at a panel here with an economist, an artist, a local government representative, somebody representing the legal and the philosophical aspects of trees. I wonder if anyone would like to comment on the role that tourism and trees has together. We take trees for granted, but there seems to be an opportunity for people to appreciate trees in the same way that we might say, for example, appreciate the southern right whale because we can go out and look at it. Any comments from the panel? Thank you.
I studied in Tasmania, so absolutely from that perspective. But one thing we spoke about with the Exceptional Tree Register was being able to create a walk around the city and make that part of the sort of tourism of Melbourne. Can people do that? One of the troubles is that these are on private property, so a lot of the time people don't want people coming into their garden, but in other occasions there was support for that, so perhaps that'll happen in the future. And I think the urban forest mapping that's up is really bringing tourism, I suspect, to the city as well. The people who are emailing those trees, and the emails are very, very intimate and fantastically diverse, aren't just from people in Melbourne, so hopefully that's helping in some way.
And I think, things like the Wilderness Society have produced self-drive guides around the Toolangi forest areas are really kind of good examples of that. You can go, those are examples of tourism, structured around viewing trees in the landscape, really, and views and valuing the many different, experiencing the many different values that kind of landscape represents.
And recent research up around Harrietville shows that if there's damage to that environment, the town is so tourism dependent on outside visitors that's actually a natural resource that the local economy depends on, and it's not the only one. So it's incredibly important to regional economies.
And botanical gardens, of course.
Thanks for that.
One of the ways of placing economic value on trees is to look at places where there are trees and how much are people willing to go there as tourists or as visitors, and how much do they spend on either public transport or driving there, and how much do they spend to stay there. And that is one of the ways that you can assist putting economic value on trees.
Terrific. Before we thank the panel, it's 5:20 on Friday afternoon. I'm now going to give you an extremely long summing up. No, I'm not. I think it's been a fascinating day, and the lesson that I draw from it, there's lots of lessons, but without going through them all, but at the end of it, I think what's coming out is that in the constitutional democracies in which we live, the community is paramount, and I think Melbourne's work is just so impressive. And I mean, an economist, Roger, says that he might go to the community and find out what their view on the appropriate discount rate is. And to me, the lesson that comes out of this is that we're heading in the right direction, we can win, but we've got to take the community with us, we've got to use art, we've got to use social media and the traditional media to do it, and Greg, we can win. Can you please join with me in thanking our panel?